So there's news coming out of rural areas all over this country right now that is really concerning to hear at this time when we're having the coronavirus pandemic ravage our nation and really causing a lot of economic damage, especially for people who are at the bottom of the economic spectrum. And so here's just a couple stories that exemplify what's going on in our agricultural sector right now. So in Idaho, a farmer buried 1 million pounds of onions, freshly harvested onions, on his own property. In southern Florida, which supplies a lot of the East Coast with produce, farmers are plowing their own crops into the ground. And in Texas, dairy farmers are dumping perfectly good milk down the drain. Why is this all happening? It's because demand is down for a lot of farmers due to the closure of restaurants or cafes and schools or reduced business that is causing certain contracts that would have come in during this time of the year to not show up for these farmers. And so the food that they grew in anticipation is going unbought. And what's especially concerning, beyond the fact that lots of restaurants and cafes are going out of business, is the fact that schools are no longer around to provide school lunch. Because we know that a lot of kids across this country depend on free or reduced price lunches. 20 million kids exactly rely on free lunches and 2 million on reduced price lunches, according to the School Nutrition Association. So just because that school has closed down doesn't mean that the kids, especially lower income kids who used to go there, no longer need that food to survive. And those previous guaranteed hot meals once every day on a school day simply aren't coming through anymore. And that's just an example of a current disconnect in our system that I'm going to get into further down the line. But right now, what we see that's most concerning is the fact that food banks are experiencing a much higher level of demand because of this lack of employment for a lot of people, which prevents them from getting the money that they could previously have to buy food from grocery stores, or the fact that a lot of lower income kids are no longer getting those school meals that they would have gotten previously at reduced price or for free. So here in Anaheim, California, cars are lined up half a mile in both directions on the nearby 57 freeway to get into the local food bank. In Minneapolis, we see cars lined up back and forth across the parking lot waiting to get food. In Detroit, a community that we know has already been devastated by factory closures and economic turmoil, it's seeing even further stress put on local food banks. And finally, the example that alerted me of this story is what happened at the San Antonio Food Bank recently, where in a single day, 10,000 people waited at a food distribution point just to feed their families. 10,000 people at a single food bank. So as you can imagine, that level of demand is not sustainable for your average local food bank. And as I'm going to show you in this clip, on an interview with the Today Show, with the head of the San Antonio Food Bank, that level of demand is really not sustainable, and it's going to make the San Antonio Food Bank run out of food, given how the current situation is going. Also, please pay attention to what he says are the kind of people who are most likely to get affected by this coronavirus pandemic, and the people who are coming in for the most part to get food from food banks. Because that also shows how the people who already were suffering the worst in our economy are the ones who are suffering the worst now in the coronavirus pandemic.
When I saw those lines of cars, I couldn't help but think if you're in need of food, you're in need of gas. So you're probably sitting, waiting in line, hoping you don't run out. And a lot of those folks it's the first time they've ever been in a food bank line like this. Describe the people you're seeing.
Well, these are the hospitality workers in our community. Many of them are coming from our hotels. Many are taxi drivers or Uber drivers. Many were impacted because their place of employment shut down and their last paycheck ran out and there's just nowhere else to go. And they know the food bank maybe from volunteering, but they've never had to ask for help. This is the case with food banks across the country. We are one of 200 food banks that are a part of the Feeding America Food Bank Network, and all of my peers in other cities are struggling to have enough food to meet the need of that line, and it's just been overwhelming.
So he mentioned Feeding America as the parent organization for the San Antonio Food Bank. And that's some really important information to know, because right now Feeding America is experiencing a 64% decrease in donations. Almost over half, 64% decrease in donations. Which is really concerning when we think about the fact that Feeding America is one of the largest organizations in terms of food banks. It runs 200 food banks across the U.S. It runs numerous soup kitchens, food pantries, shelters, and feeds 46 million people a year during good times, right? And we can imagine it's going to be a lot higher now that this coronavirus is leaving millions of people unemployed. So the question I want to talk about, beyond just the news that's going on right now, is why do we have this disparity where in Texas, just as 10,000 people are waiting at food bank lines, at the same time, there are farmers dumping milk within the same state, right? At a food bank where the food bank is running out of food essentially, and there are farmers dumping milk. How is this happening in the United States of America? How are we misallocating our resources to such a great extent? So the reason this is happening is that it's the natural result of our capitalist economic system. Because if we allow our market to be ruled by the cold forces of supply and demand, this is kind of the natural result that one would expect. So as I said before, farmers are experiencing a pretty deep drop in demand. Some farmers more than others, as restaurants, cafes, schools, etc. aren't providing the same number of orders as they would before. And if you're a fan of the free market, or if you're thinking about this from a free market perspective, your immediate conclusion would be, hey, right, if supply stays the same and demand is decreasing, then over time prices are going to go down, and people who are in trouble right now in terms of affording food to feed their families are eventually going to get what they need, and everything's going to be fine. Besides the fact that eventually doesn't really apply too well to when we're considering feeding people, let's also dive into how that free market perspective is supposed to address this issue. So that really makes sense on the surface, that supply and demand will bring prices down. But then it doesn't really explain why farmers are dumping excess crops and milk, right? So this is an example where that free market force ideology doesn't work in the real world. Because it might work for if I'm, a factory producer that makes cars or airplanes or wooden desks. But if I'm a farmer, I can't make things and leave them in storage till I can sell them. Especially if I'm growing dairy products or fruits and vegetables, that stuff is going to spoil. Which means that I can't just sit around and wait for a contract that comes in. Because my food is going to continuously spoil, and I'm going to have to try to make room for my newly harvested crops, and unfortunately let stuff that was harvested otherwise go down the drain. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And so that's just a really good example that free market forces are not going to save us here, and that we really need something else to step in. And that's where I think we need to talk about the role that the federal government has in addressing this crisis, right? Because charity usually is enough to help food banks operate, during normal times, because donations remain high as the economy is fine, and demand is pretty low at food banks because many people are still employed, right? The fact that we still have hungry people today in one of the most developed countries on earth is already a crisis that I can talk about on a later date, but let's just stick to this right now. So the federal government has the power to be that linking force between people who need food and the people who grow food, so that we no longer have this crazy, absurd system where at the same time people are dumping food as people are starving or waiting in huge lines outside depleting food banks. So charity we cannot rely on now, right? It's going down severely because people are worried about feeding their own families at this time. They can't afford to donate. And so the federal government is what we need to step in right now. the federal government can buy up surplus crops and make them available for free or for reduced prices to food banks or restaurants that can then distribute them to people so that they can be fed. So we have this potential to use the federal government as an extreme force of good, not only to literally make sure that people don't go home hungry or don't go to bed starving, but that also we can sustain farmers and restaurants that are suffering at this time. And while I think there's a fair argument that this can be done on a state level, I think that the federal government would be a greater engine for getting this force done, because we know that different states have different ratios between the amount of food they produce and the number of people that live in the state. For example, agricultural Iowa might produce way more food than the state's population needs, while urban New York probably doesn't produce enough food for the needs of the local population. Through a federal operation that works together with state governments, we can make sure that food is delegated and moved in the way that is most efficient to make sure that people are fed, right? This isn't just about turning a profit or making money. It's making sure that in a time of crisis like this, we can feed people. And so that's what I want to finish this video up with, because I just want to emphasize also that this isn't something crazy or new, right? In the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, FDR and his administration bought up massive amounts of food surpluses from local farmers to make sure that they could stay in business and, survive for the most part. So buying up surplus crops in large numbers and storing them or redistributing them isn't something that's beyond the scope of the federal government. Because if that's something that was capable with the technology of 90 years ago, it can definitely be done today in a much more efficient manner even. So what I want to end this video with is that our government can work for us if we ask it to. I know the Trump administration isn't likely to pursue a policy such as this, given its preferred free market approach to addressing certain issues. But we need to support politicians who will have the government work for us and the people of this country. Because at the end of the day, we can't just rely on supply and demand to determine who goes to bed hungry and who doesn't.